Pokemon has seen its fair share of villains of many different types. Some want to take over the world, while others want to destroy parts of it in an attempt to revert the planet to what they believe to be a better state. And with many villains, there's usually some type of organization associated with most of them. For better or worse, it's an iconic trope of this series that remains to this day. I mean, even people who have never picked up a Nintendo system of any kind know what Team Rocket is. So, of all the villains in the series, which one is the smartest? Who would you put the most faith in to genuinely get the job done long term? Well, that's what we're going to analyze today. First, I'd briefly like to talk about a pair of characters that I won't be counting primarily toward this discussion. If you want to count them as villains in the same way you would Lysander and Cyrus or something, then they are by far the smartest. Professor Sada and Turo are incredibly intelligent. But their AI professors probably aren't outright evil, despite the fact that we can label them as villains in this series, and are just a very different case altogether. I also feel like if you were to consider them villains in the same vein as the other characters I mentioned, then I feel they're just too obvious for the choice of most intelligent. But ultimately, it's the Paradise Protection Protocol that makes them battle the player. So these professors are a bit of a different example, especially since they're an extension of the original professors, which were not villainous despite not being perfect people. So let's just leave this here, as we may talk about the Gen 9 professors more in depth another time. While there are a lot of villains to talk about, there are 3 specifically I want to cover as the focal points of this video, and the first is Cyrus. Cyrus feels that the human spirit is the ultimate bane of the universe. He sees the beauty in a universe where space expands and time flows with no influence from what he sees as the weak human spirit, from which he only sees conflict. It's confirmed that Cyrus was an excellent student earlier in his life, and is generally portrayed as a very intelligent character in universe, as expected for a team leader. However, he is undeniably morbidly pessimistic. There are some villains that feel justified in the way they act because they mourn the loss of man's dignity. But Cyrus seems to believe that perhaps man never had dignity. He only sees the ugliness of the world and its people. He also only seems to feel the most negative of his emotions. And I don't think there are any instances in the Sinnoh games where he feels any positive emotions, or at least never really shows it. So Cyrus has an incredibly ambitious goal of attempting to remake the universe. A universe that solves this issue. He wants to fix what is missing in a world that was contaminated by the human spirit. It's hard to say exactly what this world would have looked like, however. By default, it's impressive that he is the boss of Team Galactic. Being able to run any of these villain teams is going to be a pain. But I have to admit, Cyrus's goal has always felt a bit out of his range compared to the more grounded goals of other villains. That's not to say that he couldn't have succeeded. We know he would have if not for the player character. But still, it's hard to shake the sheer ambition of his plan. I also think he's so emotionally cut off that it's actually a weak point for him in some ways. Sure, it's good to be cold and calculating when coming up with a vicious plan, but he's so detached, it's hard to imagine it not being a problem. Imagine if he could predict the point of view of his enemies more correctly. He'd probably be even more difficult to deal with. But the character doesn't always understand that the trainer's compassion enhances the strength of their Pokemon, and that helps lead to his defeat. And it's clear that he is learning this, yet fails to understand it even as it's happening. He's the type of person that is great at tinkering machines, but fails to understand what makes someone's heart tick. Which is a problem when you're living in a world with those supposed weak spirits he despises so much. This is why I feel like his plans are a bit out of his range, and I feel like he should have seen it coming. But his intelligence seems to be more in machines and planning. He allowed himself to become too much of a genuine nihilist. But still, there is an argument to be made for Cyrus being the most intelligent villain despite all of this. Next, let's talk about the second of the 3 villains I have in mind, Ghetsis. His plan is far more grounded than shaping the universe. He simply wants to take over Unova by making sure all the Pokemon in the region are only possessed by him. This sounds simplistic, but the way he plans this and the way it's depicted in-game really makes this whole plot feel larger than life despite technically being smaller in scale. I think what makes Ghetsis come off as a more intelligent villain than most of the others is just how he operates. He makes himself a public face and comes off as the good guy in people's eyes. He feels that Pokemon deserve liberation from humans, but he doesn't come off as too malicious about it to the public. He simply makes it sound like the logical conclusion for their true happiness. Both the aesthetic of Team Plasma and Ghetsis' methods are uncomfortably similar to a corrupt church, something that remains pretty interesting for this series. Then there's N, who he manipulated from childhood to eventually have as the puppet dictator of Team Plasma with fierce ideals and a pretty terrible mistrust of humans. I mean, the guy surrounded him by Pokemon that were abused just so he could genuinely have these ideals as he grew up to add another layer to his plan. Ghetsis is pretty messed up, but his cunning is displayed quite well in the game, as his true intentions aren't outright revealed to the player until the end, and you're able to put together the pieces yourself. There's more to Ghetsis' planning, but in the end, as you would expect, he is exposed and defeated by the player. And it's not his defeat that puts his intelligence at question for me, but more his reaction to it. There are two sides to this. First of all, he goes on the run after Black and White losing everything, but forms a new Team Plasma faction in Black and White too. So Ghetsis tries again and has something to actually show for it. He doesn't disappear from this series forever. The guy's plan to freeze Unova is also kind of insane, and that's where the other side of this shows. While he was able to give his plans another legitimate shot, he clearly lost much of his sanity between the two games. In many ways, he's probably smarter than Cyrus, but his mental fortitude is probably not as good, and that is something to consider. Ghetsis probably wasn't exactly completely sane to begin with, but when he fails again in Black and White 2, he has a total meltdown, and comes off as kind of pathetic. You're even told later that he is no longer mentally sound enough to pursue further criminal activities, meaning he's canonically totally done for in the games. With Cyrus, while he is defeated, he doesn't come off as completely broken like Ghetsis. So while I get more of a cunning vibe from Ghetsis, I can't help but think that Cyrus may have gotten what he wanted in Pokemon Platinum specifically, since he does choose to stay in the distortion world. While the game kind of just gives the vibe of him being defeated in that moment, that world is devoid of the human spirit he seems to love so much. So for him, that may have been a better ending than what Ghetsis got. At the very least, there are some interpretations that could exist where Cyrus has a better ending from his point of view than Ghetsis. It all depends on if sanity is something you value when speaking of a villain's potential intelligence. Though I'm not sure if Cyrus or Ghetsis are exactly known for being down to earth. With all this said, I tend to lean toward Ghetsis over Cyrus still as far as the most intelligent villain. But they're honestly pretty equal. And it's a tough comparison because the scale of their plots and the way their stories are told is very different. But let's talk about the third villain I want to talk about, Giovanni. Personality-wise, especially in the earlier interpretations of the character, he's usually depicted in a way that's much simpler than the previous villains I went into detail about. He's basically a powerful mafia boss, and Team Rocket in the games specifically is a bit more serious than the anime, though still often pretty goofy. Now, I should make it clear that while Giovanni is a solid iconic character, a character like Ghetsis offers significantly more substance in terms of themes and characterization. But we're not talking about the best villain or our favorite. We're trying to decide on who is the smartest villain. And Giovanni just might be him. Giovanni is pretty selfish like any other evil team leader, but he's overall a bit more down to earth than Cyrus and Ghetsis, even in failure. He's cruel, yet charismatic enough for his followers to do seemingly everything they can in their power to see if they can get him to return when he disappears after being defeated in Kanto. While the new version of Team Plasma did return with Ghetsis, Team Rocket was making a comeback with plans specifically to get Giovanni back in the fold, without him ever even asking. I think it is in fact a sign of his brilliance to act the way he does in front of others. Obviously being cruel, but never letting himself be so cruel that his power would be lost the moment he's out of the picture. He managed to do something that most corrupt leaders wish they had the ability to do: create a cult of personality with real staying power. Then there's the anime version of him, who has a presence throughout the series, albeit this is likely primarily done to keep Jesse and James relevant. But still, the anime version of him is responsible for the creation of Mewtwo, even if he wasn't literally the scientist responsible. The idea and plan to create the most powerful Pokemon at the time was put together by him. Then there's what I would call what is arguably the biggest justification for calling Giovanni the most cerebral of all the villains. The fact that he's the leader of Team Rainbow Rocket, which has several other villains working under him, including Cyrus and Ghetsis. This version of Giovanni has taken over the world, and the other villains under him have also achieved their goals in their respective universes. The fact that a version of Cyrus that succeeded in his insanely ambitious goal still working under Giovanni really says a lot about the guy. Giovanni isn't as tech smart as a lot of these other characters, but it's clear that he knows his strengths and weaknesses and operates according to that logic more effectively than most. He also knows when to stop when he's outmatched, as even Team Rainbow Rocket Giovanni knows when to gracefully step away once you beat him. This allows him to simply pick up and continue what he was doing in his other universe. And in the main games, he also is self-aware enough to know when the dream of Team Rocket has become an illusion. As he states himself, he doesn't allow himself to be so defeated that he can't potentially pursue something entirely new in the future, whether it be a new criminal activity or not. With other villains, they tend to not know when to quit until they're so utterly defeated that there's seemingly no hope left for them to pick up the pieces. Usually because they're simply too crazy, over-idealistic, or arrogant. Because of all this, I can't help but feel that Giovanni is probably the smartest of the major villains in this series, but it all depends on what you consider to be the most valuable aspect of a team leader's intelligence. Ghetsis is still a pretty valid choice. In fact, in Rainbow Rocket, he claimed Giovanni was just a pawn to him to overthrow later. Though I suspect Giovanni knew this and just didn't feel too worried about it. And of course, Cyrus and several other villains in this series that I didn't have the chance to discuss are valid picks too. They all have different ambitious plans, and they would have either succeeded or come very close if not for the player. But those three specifically are the first I personally think of when it comes to the smartest antagonist in the Pokemon franchise. The only thing that I think holds Giovanni back is that I don't think his actual Pokemon team is as strong as a lot of other antagonist battles. But some may not factor that into how smart a character is supposed to be. Well, not unless the team is really, really bad. But what do you think? Do you agree that Giovanni might be the most intelligent and clever villain in the series? Personally, I don't think he's the most well-written or thematically interesting character. But I do think he has the feats to imply he's much smarter than we give him credit for compared to other villains. But do you think it's Ghetsis instead? Cyrus? Maybe another villain from outside the main games? There's definitely a lot to choose from, and I wasn't even able to get into every major detail with the villains I mentioned, so be sure to let me know down below.